Hello, and welcome to Breaking Bread with Rivaj Maharaj, where nothing is off the table. I thought it only prudent for our first podcast to deal with, or rather investigate, the ongoings in Venezuela, given the fact that the United States um, kidnapped and extradited the elected president of Venezuela, Nicholas Maduro, to the United States to stand trial. I just wanted to take this opportunity to let you know my views on what I think is unfolding, because Venezuela is just a small pawn in a much larger game that is being played by many nations around the globe. The United States, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, became the hegemonic power on the global stage. And they held that dominance for a fairly long time without being threatened by any other major power. China was busy on its rise. India was starting to emerge. And Russia was breaking free of the shackles that had gripped it since the dissolution of the Soviet Union and President Boris Yeltsin's disastrous rule for the period in which he reigned supreme. I've made some notes here, so I'll just go through them to help you understand my reasoning and logic behind what I have to say. Now, the United States has recently released their new national strategy, national defense strategy, in terms of what they plan to do in terms of their foreign policy. And there were a few startling takeaways from that, namely that the United States, that is, decided to embrace the Monroe Doctrine. Now, for those of you that don't know, the Monroe Doctrine was instituted by President Monroe, who had essentially said that the United States would be busy with itself and its own backyard, that is, North and South America, the Western Hemisphere as such, and that they would not entertain any incursions by any other nations into their backyard. And reciprocally, they would do the same by not going out on an expansionist policy. However, the United States has done anything but that if you look at its history. Well, recent history bears much. So the Monroe Doctrine was basically America saying to the world, we will not tolerate any interference in our backyard, and reciprocally, we would not be intervening in anybody else's affairs. However, as history would prove, that was not the case. They've been responsible for many coups across Latin America, Asia, Africa, and the list goes on. But the essential part of what has happened now with Donald Trump invoking this doctrine or embracing this policy is that since 1945, you found that while Europe was left ruined and it had to get back on its feet, with the help of the Marshall Plan, the Americans decided to rebuild Europe. But that rebuilding came with a cost, because they strategically had then placed in their assets and began shaping what post-World War II Western Europe would look like. Then they also needed to stem the tide of communism that was spreading not only through Europe but across the globe. So you had NATO, which was formed as an opposition to the Warsaw Pact, and the North Atlantic Treaty was there as a protection measure against Soviet expansion by way of the Warsaw Pact. What has happened since Donald Trump coming into power, the second term of his as President of the United States, is that he's effectively said to Europe, Europe is on its own. Germany needs to rearm, and Germany needs to become more of a strong voice within Europe. Naturally, this left the Germans in a bit of a muddle, the French as well, the British. And you see, since the end of the Second World War, America was seen as the big brother and the guarantor of safety and security. Donald Trump has now removed that safety net. He's pivoting back to his domain, and why it kind of makes sense is because he doesn't see Europe as being the front for the next lot of challenges that the United States is going to face. You see, China is a rapidly rising power. It's now the other superpower on the world stage. And as they expand their influence across the world, they've made notable incursions by way of expanding their influence into Latin America, into Africa, into the rest of Asia. And the Americans see this as a threat. So, as with the Panama Canal, Trump forced their hand there. He's now gone and destabilized the regime in Venezuela, putting an end to any stranglehold that the Chinese would have in that region. He's basically fortifying the United States in its own backyard before it then goes on to what I believe is going to be an inevitable war between the United States and China. So if you look at Trump's recent statements where he's spoken of, I think it's called the C5, he's now recognized that China, Russia, the United States, India, and Japan should actually be sitting down at the table and deciding the way things should work, as opposed to the G7 and G20 and all these other alphabet soup organizations that tend to be around. I believe that his references to establishing a firmer foothold in their backyard vis-a-vis the new, well, he calls it the Donroe Doctrine. I think my personal take on it is that when the Russians went into Ukraine, they didn't go in with the intention of taking the country like the Germans did with their blitzkrieg operations. I think that Putin understood that Biden was not somebody that could be reasoned with, and that the United States under the Biden administration was a lost cause. He anticipated that Trump would come in because sentiment was swinging hugely away from Biden's policies and the way the West was heading. And he understood that at some point Trump would be voted in at the next election, and then he would be able to sit down and reason and get a deal going. I think that this was all done in advance. I think that there were backdoor negotiations going on between Trump and Putin. where the Russians were allowed essentially to basically keep whatever they wanted of Ukraine, and would the Russians would not interfere with the Americans in terms of Venezuela. Now, the reason I say this, some of you might disagree, but hear me out. When Assad's regime fell in Syria, Jolani and his band of merry men literally breezed in, taking over the country. There was virtually no opposition. Assad was flown out, taken to Moscow, and the Syrian regime had crumbled. A very, very similar situation has happened in Venezuela, where you find that the Americans went in, took Maduro out, and the only pushback you got from the Chinese were some strong words, and the Russians as well. And I think that's where it's going to end. I don't think they have an appetite to push this any further. The United States military, whatever you have to say, is a vast military, and I think they're fairly capable. However, they're not as battle tested as, let's say, the Russians, who have been fighting the last 4 years in Ukraine. But don't forget, they've just come off from Afghanistan. So when you compare them to the Chinese, who have got virtually no combat experience in the recent past, I think also why I make this point is that Trump has repeatedly pushed Zelensky towards getting a deal with Putin. Now, we know that the United Kingdom, along with the rest of the Western allies, are vehemently opposed to this. However, I think the writing's on the wall. Trump's realized the Russians have been fighting in Ukraine for the last 4 years. The Ukrainians, while fighting bravely, I don't think they're going to be in a position to win this war. I think it was evident from the word go. However, Trump has realized that despite everything that NATO, including the Americans, have thrown at the Russians, they've still managed to make advances. So I think in that respect, he thought it would be better to just get Ukraine wrapped up. Also, Russia has a lot of resources that if trade could resume between the United States and Russia, it would be beneficial to both countries. We know also that the Russian economy, while I know a lot of people say it's taking a hit, and it might be taking a hit, however, it has not succumbed to the sanctions. I think that deal I spoke about between Putin and Trump prior to Trump coming into office has a bit of precedence when you look at Reagan coming into power and the Ayatollah Khomeini releasing the hostages because a better deal was offered to him by Reagan rather than Carter. So there is that precedent, and I think for that reason the possibility is always there, but also for the way things have played out. Now the Venezuelans, I think Maduro's Vice President Rodriguez, I really feel that she had a hand in Maduro being removed. And I think a lot of what we see is just optics for the camera, where she says that she will stand by the Venezuelan people and that Maduro is the rightful president, and then Trump has to threaten her, and then she says to the Americans, we'll work with you. And I think that's all just optics, because Trump at the beginning knew that Machado, I think her name is, was not gonna cut it. They tried with Guaido, that didn't work either. So I think that this is all optics to have got so that it looks like there's some sort of resistance. But I think the Americans paid a lot of money for this operation to go as smoothly as it did. Um, if you look at Syria, going just pivoting back to Syria for a little bit, the Iranians and the Russians were heavily involved in propping up Assad's regime in Syria. And when Jolani and his group moved in, there was nothing. There was no pushback from either of them. And I suspect that that is the same thing that's going to happen to the Iranians. I think that they're on borrowed time. And I think that the current Iranian regime is not going to be around very much longer. I think the writing's on the wall. I think what's going to happen now is Trump is going to fortify his borders in terms of his backyard. He's going to get all his ducks in a row. He's already made overtures to the Mexicans. He's demonstrated his will for regime change by this operation in Venezuela. So it's basically, you're either with us or you're against us. Similar language to the one that George Bush used after 9/11. I think also there's a message in there for Europe. Get your house in order, get your act together, because regime change can come anywhere. The other thing I think that's happening is, if you look at it, he's also looking at BRICS. And I'll touch on this further in another episode. But what struck me as really, really strange was 2 or 3 days ago, a South African general saying that things in South Africa are not going the way they should, basically, and that the South African army needs the proper equipment and proper resources in order to defend its borders. Very, very strange rhetoric coming out of South Africa. But that came on the heels of a report that was released on one of the news channels, I think it was Sky or the BBC, where Canada had complained about the crime rate in South Africa and speaking about how unstable it is and how crime is escalating. I think it was something like 63 deaths a day or 67 deaths a day in South Africa. And what struck me as really strange was that the Chinese had also agreed to this. So, yeah, we'll touch on this further in another episode. But if you see, he's starting to get his ducks in a row. They'll consolidate power, and this is not something that's going to end just with Trump, because once his term's over, whoever comes in to replace him is going to continue with the same playbook. They're going to continue with the same playbook, and they're going to move ahead towards isolating China. And I think they're preparing for a final military confrontation with the Chinese. We will definitely be going into depth in another episode regarding these points. This has been our first video that we've released, and I'm sure there's a lot of room for improvement. So I'm asking you to please bear with me. This is the first time I'm doing something like this. I'm not somebody that's really happy being behind the camera, but the subjects in question are something that I'm really passionate about. So I thought let's take the plunge. And I think we could only get better. I humbly ask you to please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. help us grow and to help us with the algorithm. Thank you very much, and see you in the next episode. Goodbye.